Greetings from Lord British. Many of you also have learned by now that my real name is Richard Garriot. Tonight I'd like to talk to you about the history of the Ultima series. I'd like to send my greetings, of course, first out to those of you who have been playing Ultimas now for 10 years. This is the 10th year anniversary of Ultima, and I would especially like to thank those of you who have been with me now for those many years. But also, of course, I'd like to extend my greetings and thank you to the new players, those for whom either this is their first or one of their first Ultimas played yet. Ultimas for me have been a very big part of my life, a very meaningful part of my life, and I hope that you will find the experience of playing them to also have some meaning for you. Like we said, this is now, of course, the 10th year of Ultimas, and at the ripe old age of 28, that puts it back at the age of 18, really, when I was first working on a series called Ultima. But, so you can understand how that's really been a major influence in my life as well, considering it has essentially consumed all of my adult life. I consider myself really quite fortunate for the many breaks which have fallen my way down through the years, but I'm sure you will also understand the great deal of work and effort which has gone into these games. For me now, after 10 years, Ultima is really more than just a game to me. It's very much a real part of my life. In many ways you can say Ultima has become my life. And the best way for you to understand that, which is one of the things I'd like to relate to you tonight, is for you to understand the influences and forces in my life that were taking place prior to the beginning of the series, and also to understand the evolution of the series as it's gone on. To get to the beginning of the Ultima series, you really have to go well before the publication of the first Ultima, and you really need to go back to my freshman year in high school. It was in my freshman year in high school that I was first exposed to computers, and very shortly thereafter, along with my exposure to computers, I was exposed to two other major forces, one of which was fantasy games, of course, like Dungeons and Dragons and Tunnels and Trolls, but also in the literary world, Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. And it was really those three things, which all three hit me at approximately the same time in my life, which really was the turning point of what began my progression into what has now become the long history of Ultimas. Through my high school career, the high school I went to really only offered one computer programming class, and so after taking one semester of the class, there was really nothing more you could do, and that first class was only in BASIC. Fortunately, however, I was a very active participant in science fairs at my school. In fact, I entered a science fair every year from my kindergarten year all the way to my senior year in high school. And it was through science fairs that I became very familiar with the faculty, and myself and two other students convinced the faculty that we had a strong enough desire to learn programming that they let us have a class to ourselves with no teacher, no curriculum. All we had to do was have a project that we were working on, and at the end of the semester they would look at our progress on the project and give us a grade accordingly. And so for the remaining 3 years of high school, I had as my project writing fantasy role-playing games upon the school's computer. During those 3 years, the remaining last 3 years of high school, I actually wrote 28 small fantasy role-playing games. Many of them, of course, were never completed, but really a fairly large number were. I'd say about 10 of those 28 actually made it through to completion and would run. And if you look at those programs, many of which I still have printouts of, or the paper tape, since I always had to do my work on paper tape in those days, if you look at how those games operated, they have a very, very striking similarity to the modern-day Ultimas. The way they would work is, at first the player would type in a command, say, for instance, to move north, and what you would get is the teletype would then print out a new list of a 10 by 10 or so area around the player, where asterisks would be walls, and letters would be these four monsters, and little X's for doors, things of that nature, which, if you think about the way tile graphics and Ultimas work even today, there's a striking similarity. It was my senior year in high school, just after graduation from high school actually, that I went to work for a Computerland store selling computers, and was first exposed to the Apple computer. This was kind of the next big change, because the Apple computer, for the first time, as opposed to having a paper tape reader and 10 character per second teletype for printing it out, it had graphics. When I first saw the Apple, I was inspired by a game that I saw called Escape, which I'm sure very few of you remember back then in 1979 or so. But Escape was a little 3D maze game. It was in low-resolution block graphics where you had to walk around through a maze and then you could eventually find your way out. Well, inspired by those three-dimensional graphics, I sat down and I said, hey, I can do three-dimensional graphics, but I can do it in high-res graphics and with the much more detailed line drawings. And I wanted to take one of these 28 games that I had already written over and over and over again. Really also, by the way, if it wasn't obvious through that period, that it was writing those games over and over and over again, which is the way that I taught myself to program. Well, I turned this around again, and I began working on one on the Apple. So I worked out, it took me really quite a bit of time, most of the summer after my sophomore year in high school, to work out what perspective view graphics could be worked like. I was a big geometry student. I had a lot of fun with geometry, and didn't have quite so much fun with, but I knew trigonometry, and worked out mathematical perspective, put together a small fantasy role-playing game, and I called it Akalabeth. And Akalabeth, when I finished it, was really a game that I'd written for myself and for my friends to play, never really intending on having it published. But the owner of the Computerland store where we worked at said, hey, you really ought to publish that. And I don't know if any of you remember back then, but state-of-the-art packaging back in those days was a Ziploc bag and a cover sheet. And so I went out and I spent, at the time, what I thought was just an enormous amount of money, $200, to go down to the local print shop and had some little cover sheets printed up and like a 6-page manual, many of which actually I still have downstairs. I was just thumbing through those myself the other day. And copied a bunch of discs. Floppy disks themselves used to cost about $5 a piece for a blank disc when I used to have those. And so I copied myself up a bunch of them and started hanging them on the wall in the Computerland store where I was working. And my games at Akalabeth really looked just as high quality as any of the other games on the shelf, because the other companies that were just getting started back then, the Border Buns and California Pacific, that was really the stage that they were at as well. Well, in the first week that I was selling those, one of approximately 8 copies that I sold during that first week found its way through someone who purchased it in Arizona, who then mailed it on to California to a friend of theirs, to a company called California Pacific. California Pacific, by the way, was the publisher for an individual named Bill Budge, who I'm sure many of you do remember. He's still active today. Bill Budge, in the late 70s, as far as I know, was the programmer. Bill Budge had 3 or 4 projects out, which I know I was a big fan of. I mean, if anything, I would have to say Bill Budge was my mentor of that era. Well, I got a call one day from California Pacific saying there were plane tickets waiting for me at the airport. So I flew to California and I signed a piece of paper and they started mailing me money. And that is literally exactly how I got into this industry. You could say very much accidentally, but also, of course, it's turned out to be very, very fortunate for me indeed. Well, that first project through California Pacific did very well. I mean, Akalabeth sold about 30,000 copies on the Apple, which even for today is really a very large number of copies for a title on one platform. However, and in fact, the royalties that I collected on that game really were enough to pay for my entire college education. Well, I sat back after that and I said, gee, if this project, which I wrote really for myself, never intended for public consumption, has done so well, I knew that if I just started over and worked on another project, intending it for public consumption, that I could do a much better job. And of course, throughout high school, when I wrote those 28 games, what I'd been doing was really teaching myself to program. I would write one game, I would learn a great deal by writing it, I'd throw it away to start the next one. And that's what I'd done 28 times through high school. That's really what Akalabeth was. And when I was through with Akalabeth, I threw it away and started in on the first Ultima. Well, the first Ultima originally, in fact, was not going to be called Ultima. It was really going to be called Ultimatum. But prior to its release, we discovered that there was a board game called Ultimatum, and so we truncated that name to Ultima, which in fact now in the long run I like a lot better. Well, the first Ultima, as I was working in it, another interesting point about these is all these predecessors, all these 28 games plus Akalabeth, and the first Ultima were completely written in BASIC. As I was working on Ultima, there was one aspect of the game which I was really struggling with, which was how to represent the outdoors. I was getting the three-dimensional dungeons with the line drawings and things down pretty well, but I was having trouble with the outdoors. And that's where a good friend of mine, a man named Ken Arnold, comes in. Ken, who was another employee there at the Computerland store where I was still working at this point, it was really the person who I must credit with the invention of what I now call tile graphics, which is the visual representation that the Ultimas have had really through till to date, and have been emulated and copied throughout the world really at this point in other products. The first tile graphics that we worked on, though, of course, what it is it's a little bitmapped image or a little bit of memory which is thrown up on the screen that graphically represents what the world can look like. In the current Ultimas, we have very sophisticated editors where we can visually build those shapes and while you're seeing them in usage. Well, in those earliest days, we actually had to draw the things out on graph paper, convert those graphs into binary numbers. Because it was on an Apple and the graphics on an Apple are very strange, we had to actually reverse the binary numbers, convert those binary numbers into a stream of hex digits, enter those hex digits by hand into the computer, and then try running the program and see what it looked like. And if there was even one mistake, we had to start that entire process over for each and every one of those little tiles we wanted to build. One tile, also by the way, is, for instance, a piece of grass. A square of grass is what one tile was. In the first Ultima, we used about 32 tiles with which to create that world. Well, the first Ultima, when it finally came out, which was about a year later after First Akalabeth, about 10 years ago, did significantly better than its predecessor. Akalabeth, when it came out on the top 30 polls, just barely made it on the top 30 polls. The first Ultima broke the top 20 on the top 30 polls. Well, after the end of the first Ultima, that's when I sat back and said, hey, gee, I've learned a great deal now about writing, larger fantasy role-playing games here with this one. Gee, if I only did it in machine language, I could do a lot better product. It could be faster, I could fit more into the machine, things of this nature. So that's when I began working on Ultima 2. Well, quite literally, Ultima 2 was the very first machine language program I ever wrote. I didn't learn it in school, I didn't learn it by writing other smaller things first. I stepped in cold turkey, having known only BASIC before in my whole life, and started in writing Ultima 2. There was a person named Tom Lures, who also worked for California Pacific at that point in time, who is a man who wrote a game, for those who can have their Wayback Machines turned on, named Appleoids, which was kind of a asteroids kind of a game, but where you shoot up apples. And I was roommating with him over there at California Pacific, and it was really Tom who kind of handheld me through the very painful process of coming up to speed on machine language. Ultima 2, of course, since I was learning a new language, and since the size and scope of the game was significantly bigger than the original Ultima, it took me quite a bit longer to create as well. In fact, Ultima 2, other than perhaps Ultima 6, was the one that took me the longest to work on. It took me about 2 years. Well, during that 2-year period of time when I was working on it, a number of other things happened. Most significant of which was California Pacific, my original publisher, was going out of business. With them going out of business, of course, I suddenly had to decide to go look for another publisher. I was very, very pleasantly surprised when I finally did say, uh-oh, I'm a free agent again, I need to start looking. I really had no idea of the success of the Ultima series had really become known to other publishers. And so I really got a call from most all of the other major publishers in the industry expressing some interest in publishing the next Ultima. However, back in those days, which was about 82 at this point in time, most of the games coming out on the marketplace in that period of time were essentially arcade game knockoffs. Things, the people who could come out with, as soon as a hot coin-op game came out, whoever got the first knockoff of it out usually made a fair bit of money. And usually there were 2 or 3 people that came out with a knockoff of those games, but the later ones didn't really make much money. But those games took people more like 2 or 3 months to create, whereas an Ultima was taking me, 9 months to 2 years to create. And so I had a much more personal tie to exactly how that product was dealt with when it was released into the marketplace. And so when I was looking for a publisher for Ultima 2, I already had some very specific ideas about how I wanted that game presented to the public. Most particularly was, for instance, I didn't want a Ziploc bag anymore. I wanted a box. I also wanted extensive documentation. And worst of all, I wanted a cloth map. And when I got calls from all these publishers and I sent them back information about what I really wanted to do with my game, whenever they saw, particularly when they saw the cloth map, it made virtually every publisher completely drop out of the race as far as even being remotely interested in publishing Ultima 2, and the only one that stuck around was Sierra. And Sierra, who at that time was called Online and later changed their name to Sierra Online, and now I believe has reduced their name back down to just Sierra, Sierra actually would put it in the contract that they would give me the box and the cloth map and all those things I wanted, and that was really the principal reason that I moved over to Sierra for that product. In 1983, in the middle of the first major slump of the software industry, we decided to form Origin Systems. Now, Origin Systems, like I said, was formed in the first slump, which is really a pretty bad time to try to form a company in the middle of an industry slump. And the only reason we succeeded really at all was that our first product, what became Ultima 3, of course, since it was already a well-known title, it opened up many of the doors that were becoming closed to many of the other smaller or new companies emerging in the field. Now, Ultima 3's major changes over Ultima 2 were principally in the technology. That was where I introduced multiple characters in your party, separate combat screens where detailed combat could take place, where you could move your characters around, and the gate travel and things of this nature that really made Ultima 3's big advancement strictly technological. Well, of course, after finishing Ultima 3, I, of course, began work on Ultima 4. But that is really where I believe, here as we begin Ultima 4, where the major change in the Ultima series began. And there's really a great deal of what's happening in my personal and professional life that goes into what was happening right there at that instant in time. First of all, of course, since Ultima 3 was the first game that we published ourselves through Origin Systems, it was the first game through which that the people's responses, the mail received by the users, fan mail if you want to call it that, that was the first time that I ever received that directly myself. And so it was the first time I got feedback directly from the players themselves. It's also, of course, the first time I received not only the mail of positive comments, but also the hate mail from the religious extremists and things of that nature. It's also the point in time where, let's see, if I look back to how old I was, it must have been at least 21 or 23, somewhere in that window by then. It's kind of the age of, you could say, somewhat maturing as an individual. It was also a period of time where you begin to reflect on what I've now been doing already since 1976, and you begin to wonder if, is this like just playing games, or how long is this going to go on? Is this a valid way to really make a living? Or, is this going to come to an end sometime soon? It was thought processes like that going through my head that really made Ultima 4 the turning point, where I sat back and I said, look, I've learned how to program computers. I've learned how to write fantasy games. I've mastered the programming techniques now after doing it so many times. The storylines that I put into the earliest Ultimas, which are still the storylines for the vast majority of my competitors and for the mass majority of these kinds of games, if not these kinds of fantasy movies, were all kind of go out and slay the big evil bad guy wizard kind of scenario. Well, after regurgitating that scenario 3 times, I was tired of working on just hack and slash fight the monster kinds of games. Even though, of course, I don't give any credence at all to the extremists who claim that fantasy games are hurting their children and things of this nature, I was at least concerned enough to realize that based upon the letters I was getting back and just upon the quantity of people out there playing Ultimas, that in some way, even if in only a very small way, I was touching the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who were playing my games. And with that came a sense of both neatness and fun and having that kind of opportunity, but also a very real feeling of responsibility that must come with that. And so that was really the foundation of what started the story evolution of Ultima 4. Ultima 4 became a game where there was no big evil antagonist to defeat. There was no real great monsters to fight, although there was of course some fighting and some swords and sorcery involved. The main focus of the game changed dramatically. In this game, instead of having an antagonist, you were out to prove yourself to be a person of great virtue. I kind of equate it much more to something like an Arthurian quest for the Holy Grail, where the evil wizards of the past are gone, and the people themselves, though, of course, they're still evil in the world. They're still thieves and brigands and people not treating each other right. And so you have to show the people the right way to live a life. And in Ultima 4, the computer essentially played Big Brother, where as you moved around through the world and through your actions and deeds, which sometimes seem like very mundane deeds, like how when you buy and sell goods and when you talk to people, the computer would, without telling you, keep tally on when you would do things like when you would lie, when you would cheat, when you would take advantage of people. It would also keep track of when you helped people, when you went out of your way to do something nice for someone which didn't even necessarily help you in your direct physical quests. And in that way, by the game playing Big Brother, it could watch your actions, and then much later in the game, when it came to time, basically when the reckoning day came, so to speak, it could sit back and it could judge you, and it could say, hey, look, you're a really nice guy, you're doing really good, you're very valorous and strong, but boy, you're really a cheating scumbag. And so in that way, you could say, oh gosh, through my everyday repetitive actions, you could go into some shrines and meditate and find out exactly what things you could do in life to exemplify the virtues that the game wanted to push. And another big thing was happening here. Ultima's been becoming bigger and bigger. And at this point in time, when we were working on Ultima 4, it was about halfway through working on Ultima 4 that it became very clear that I was never going to be able to finish this one on my own. And so for the first time, whereas each and every Ultima to date, I had worked on it almost completely exclusively, I needed help. And so about halfway through the project, one of our employees, a guy named Steve Muse, was brought in to assist in the completion of that project to make sure it could come out in something less than 10 years.